reclining figures in this print are almost instantly recognisable as Henry Moore's. It's a print that was made in 1963, relatively early in his experimentation with lithography. And you'll see in the bottom left-hand corner the name of the man who printed it, Stanley Jones. I was drawn to this print because it's almost a sculpture in two parts. We've got these black figures that have been drawn on one plate, but then behind them, this strange, brushed, calligraphic background, almost a sculptural work on its own. As we'll see in this exhibition of prints by Henry Moore, all of them printed by and from the personal collection of Stanley Jones, Moore worked with a pretty limited range of themes. The reclining figure, mother and child, warrior heads and helmet forms, and abstract interior and exterior shapes. It's not so much that he was obsessed with these various themes as he found them inexhaustible, that he found in the various manipulations of the human body, its relationship with one another, an endless variety of subjects, of new understandings of the way we interact with the world around us. We'll see in this exhibition the whole range of Moore's subject matter, and we'll also see in these various prints Moore exploring, experimenting, having his creative way with the new medium. I hope you enjoy. Stanley Jones, the master lithographer at the Curwen Studio, always thought there was a special affinity between sculptors and printmaking, particularly lithography. We were very lucky this weekend to have the wonderful Dominic Kemp, a connoisseur of modern British prints, talking about Henry Moore's relationship with Stanley Jones, who Dominic actually knew personally.
Stanley was born in 1933 in Wigan, and so it's important to remember that actually, because Henry Moore was born in 1898, so when they first met in 1958, I mean, Henry Moore would have been, 60, and he would have been old enough to be Stanley's father, but Stanley was the teacher, the mentor, and taught me everything I know about lithography and raised Henry Moore's game. And to a degree they went on a journey together, because Stanley was pioneering the technique and Henry Moore was so keen and eager and tenacious, that was his spirit, to learn, that he went with it, and he produced, you can, from the earlier lithographs to the later lithographs, the journey that they made.
Something about the tactile quality of the medium, working with a stone, metal, plastic plate, the textures that you're working with, the layering, the kind of procedural quality of printmaking was very similar to sculpture, whether it's exhuming a work from a block of marble or the procedural process of casting a maquette in clay in bronze. Certainly, Henry Moore was fascinated, addicted to the process once he was introduced to it, and once he began to learn from Stanley the kind of effects that he could get from the plate, the kind of layerings of colours, of thin inks that would give him qualities that he'd never really experimented with before. He became an extremely prolific printmaker, producing more than 700 prints in various mediums. But lithography seemed to hold a special place in his heart. And in the prints that you'll see in this exhibition, ranging from his very earliest years working with Stanley Jones in the late 1950s, right the way up to the early 1980s, you'll see that he brought the whole range of his sculptural world into these prints. We'll also see that from the monumental world of sculpture, where Moore was often working at huge scale, printmaking brought things down to a more intimate level, a level of kind of experimentation, of exploration, which he could find on the stone block in front of him. We'll see the whole range of Moore's work from its most abstract, though, as he was at pains to insist, he was rarely a purely abstract artist. Even stone studies, the studies of strange sculptural heads inspired by Mexican, by ancient Aztec sculptures, always, he said, had a top and a bottom, a head and a body, limbs extending, the relationship between two people, for example, or that of a mother and child. The mother and child was one of the central, enduring themes of Moore's career. It's one that was highly charged for him, charged with psychological, with historical significance. We think of things like the Madonna in Christian art, but also the image of the mother and child and of fertility more generally in the worlds of American art, of African art, of Polynesian carving, the kind of worlds of primitive so-called carving that Moore was so interested in his early years. It's also a subject that had a real personal, intimate resonance for him. He came from a large family, and his mother looms large in his art and in his life. As a sculptor, what also interested him about the mother and child theme was this intimate relationship between two forms. You see it especially in an image like this, where we've actually got a third figure introduced too. The idea of the negotiation between a smaller and larger figure absolutely fascinated him. We look at a print like this, and it's a strange image to decipher. We see these three figures immediately, but the closer we look, the sort of recognisable details that we expect to see from a figure study, the faces, the shape of the breasts and the hips around this female figure have been changed. We've got what almost looks like a kind of viaduct has been drawn across here. We've got these strange, almost calligraphic marks. Moore was always bringing elements of the landscape, surrealist elements into his abstractions. What's especially telling about this print for me, though, is that there are certain qualities that Moore looked to when he was making his figures that he knew in the human psyche were associated with the things that we think of about the mother and child theme. There's elements of protection, of fertility and fecundity. He recognised the roundness of the earth, the roundness of fruit, the round curves that we find all over the human body were in some way symbolic of this life-giving force. But however abstract, however symbolic Moore was with his various themes, they were always derived from close, direct observation. Observation of the human form, but also of human behaviour, human relationships. I love some of these studies of mother and child, almost at play, at relaxation, because they capture not just that sense of protection, that kind of universal image of the mother and child, but the very particular behaviours that children have around their parents. I love the way that these children are kind of climbing on, standing on, playing around their mother, almost as if she was a work of sculpture herself. As someone with little children, I know that's exactly how babies, how young toddlers behave. We're also very lucky in this archival collection that we have access to one of Moore's very own lithographic plates here. You can see the image to which it contributed, and over here this black line plate on which Moore has done most of the drawing. It's a fascinating insight into not just Moore's process as a printmaker, but also into Moore working at a much smaller scale, at this kind of intimate, exploratory medium of printmaking that brings him very close to the page, a completely different way of working than he was perhaps used to. The more interested Henry Moore became in printmaking, the more he began to dedicate time and studio space to it, the more useful, the more important and significant Stanley Jones would be to helping him unlock the medium's potential. In particular, this was really one of the first times Moore had an opportunity to experiment with colour. And colour in printmaking was a completely different world from that of painting or a drawing. Because you have these thin inks that can overlap one another, you get second, third, sometimes four colours cheated from these overlapping different colours. We can see this really clearly in this series of images here, where Moore has very carefully worked out how these different colours are going to relate with one another and impact on each other as they're printed one over the other. We come to this sidewall and I think some of the strongest prints in this exhibition. Drawing had been a near daily activity for Henry Moore from his very earliest years, both as an artist but also as a young child. He was obsessed with drawing. And it's amazing to see the point at which his drawing had developed by this point in the late 1970s. As a point of comparison, I have this. It's a facsimile of a sketchbook that Moore produced in 1926. It's fascinating not just to compare how much the drawing had developed, how strong his hand, his identity, his graphic identity is at this point, but also to see how some of the ideas, the kernels, the seeds that had begun nearly 50 years ago had come to fruition now. There's a line here, for example, "Stay on the big design and play of masses until power of form is achieved. Have an idea and express it powerfully." Well, that's this print in a nutshell. Drawing went through a strange transformation in Henry Moore's life. In the early years of his career, it was almost subservient to his sculpture. It was very programmatic. He was drawing designs that would eventually become sculptures themselves. But he describes how in the years before and immediately after the Second World War, it was almost like drawing, carving, sculpture, they each became autonomous. He said they almost separated like a married couple divorcing, but then eventually reconciling as friends living separately. Suddenly his drawings could live and find life on their own. I think that's the importance of printmaking for Henry Moore. Looking at images like these two on this side behind me, it allowed him to explore ideas where you have these entangling limbs, these surface qualities, textures that he wouldn't have been able to in his sculptural work or in pure drawing. By the mid-1970s, Henry Moore really had nothing left to prove. And I think his turning to the sheep subject, a series of sketches of sheep living nearby his studio, is kind of evidence of that, the fact that he was so respected at this point, he could really take on any subject he wanted. There's a funny story behind these sheep images, and they date to 1972. It's a year when Moore had a massive exhibition in Florence, and so his studio was packed with people boxing up sculptures to be sent out to this exhibition. The space was so crowded that he couldn't work, so he found another little studio space that looked onto a field that he let to a local farmer to let them graze their sheep. And it was here, looking out at the sheep in the field below him, that suddenly he saw what had at once been these sort of strange, shapeless, fluffy balls of wool suddenly reveal themselves. He could see the intricacy of the bodies working beneath them. The art historian Kenneth Clark describes how he would kind of be stalked by these sheep on his daily routine. He'd walk from his home in Hertfordshire to the studio and the sheep would be staring at him. He'd work, he'd leave for a coffee and the sheep would be staring still. It's kind of reflective of sheep as this kind of permanent presence in this country. We're all kind of aware of them there in the countryside. But for Moore, I think he fell in love with them. He fell in love also with the idea that they had this kind of biblical presence, this classical presence in old mythology, the idea of the shepherd and his flock. And he looked at them with the same eye that he would the human figure, understanding the anatomy, finding new significance in the form in front of him. I thought I would end this walkthrough on a slightly different image from this exhibition. It's a simple portrait, a portrait of Moore's hand that he's had held out in front of him. But I think it captures what we've talked about as we've gone around this exhibition. And that's Moore's ability to look out at the world, to understand what he sees, to look with fresh eyes, and find in very simple, universal, central themes a reflection of the world around him, a reflection of a world that he found endlessly fascinating. Even more than that, I think it shows that for Moore, printmaking had become such an important facet in his life, an area of intimacy where he could explore ideas on their own merit, in their own regard. We've been very lucky to have these prints from Stanley Jones' personal archive, many of them dedicated to the printer himself. They're available online and here at the gallery. I hope you've enjoyed this exhibition walkthrough of Henry Moore's printmaking.